Early March 1943, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The name hangs in the mouth like a map of storms and mud, a place where heat presses on the skin and the jungle smells of rain and diesel and fear. The wrench slipped from oil-stained hands as Captain Paul Irvin Gunn stared at the modified bomber before him. He did not drop the wrench because he was clumsy. He let it fall because the sight before him made the world tilt. A man who had spent decades with grease under his nails, who had learned aircraft like one learns an old friend, now staring at something that seemed both impossible and inevitable. Inside that aircraft was something that should not exist, something that violated every regulation in the United States Army Air Force's manual, something his commanding officer had not officially authorized. Rules are made to hold an order together. Sometimes, in the worst of times, men tear them like paper and make new tools from the fragments. 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns protruded from where a bombardier's glass nose should have been. Picture it, a glass nose gone, replaced with metal and teeth. 8 hungry mouths of iron pointing forward, ready to vomit steel across decks and superstructures. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, designed for precision bombing from altitude, had been transformed into something entirely different. A different animal was born in that hangar. Where the B-25 had been a measured instrument of distance and patience, it became a thunderbolt of close violence. A ship killer, a commerce destroyer, an illegal experiment that would either save the Pacific theater or earn Gunn a court-martial. He stood on the knife edge between innovation and disgrace. In war, that knife is often sharpened by grief. What neither Gunn nor anyone else knew was that this unauthorized modification, born from desperation and personal fury, would trigger the most devastating defeat the Japanese Navy would suffer in the entire Pacific campaign. Fate has a way of hitching its cart to single moments. A madman's idea, a welded bracket, the stubbornness of an old aviator refusing to bow to procedure. The mathematics of Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific were being written not in battle plans approved by Washington, but in welding shops and maintenance hangars by a 43-year-old maverick who was fighting his own private war. There are histories written in marble, and then there are histories written in sweat. The latter smell of cutting oil and hot metal and the quiet fury of a man who has lost everything. The journey to this moment had begun 2 years earlier, on December 8, 1941, Manila time. Dates like that arrive with thunder. Lives before, ordinary, impatient, warm, split into a before and after. Paul Irvin Gunn, known to absolutely no one as Pappy yet, stood at Nichols Field, watching Japanese bombers methodically destroy the American air forces in the Philippines. Imagine standing while the sky itself betrays you, metal birds threading fire through friends and colleagues. That single morning rearranged Gunn's soul. As manager of the fledgling Philippine Airlines, he had 4 Red Beach 18 civilian aircraft under his command. Civilian wings turned to instruments of war overnight. The thin thread of normal life snapped, and men like Gunn found themselves handed new names and new burdens. Within hours, Major General Louis Brereton would commandeer those aircraft and commission Gunn as a captain in the Army Air Corps. The world flipped. A civilian's hangar became a roster of orders. A life of quiet flight became a ledger of targets. What should have been a brief wartime service would become a 3-year odyssey of innovation, revenge, and technological revolution. Revenge colors decisions in a way strategy rarely anticipates. Technology, when fed by that venom, becomes both angel and demon. Gunn was 42 years old, a former Navy Chief Petty Officer who had served 20 years as an enlisted naval aviator before retiring in December 1939. 2 decades in the sky teaches a man to listen to an airplane's heartbeat. That listening would become his instrument. He had learned to fly in the 1920s, had served with the legendary Top Hatters fighter squadron, and had instructed at Pensacola Naval Air Station. Prideful tone. The old world of barnstorming and leather helmets still echoed in him, a very different life threaded into the new violence. He knew aircraft inside and out, not from textbooks, but from 2 decades of working on them, flying them, and occasionally crashing them. Chuckles softly. Crash, mend, fly again. That rhythm, brutal and honest, was his apprenticeship. But on that December morning, technical expertise meant nothing. Gunn had a more immediate problem. With tension, expertise is a dry tinder. Grief lights the match.
His wife, Clara Louise, called Polly by everyone who knew her, and their 4 children were in Manila as Japanese forces closed in. Names like anchors: Polly, Connie, Julie, Paul Jr., Nathan. They live in a different register when you think of them as people and not as news. His 2 sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers. His daughters, Connie and Julie, were younger. Youth folded into alarm. The ordinary catastrophes of adolescence suddenly had the jagged backdrop of war. The family lived in Manila while Gunn ran the airline, a comfortable expatriate existence that had evaporated overnight. Comfort is fragile like old glass. It shatters and you pick up the pieces with bleeding hands. In the chaotic weeks that followed, Gunn flew reconnaissance and transport missions across the disintegrating Philippine defenses. He became a thread in a ragged net, trying to knit safety for those he loved. He dodged Japanese fighters, survived being shot down over the jungle, walked out to safety, and immediately climbed into another aircraft. That is how some men live in war, each survival a debt repaid by more risk. On one mission, he earned a Distinguished Flying Cross by flying an unarmed transport into Bataan to deliver medical supplies to besieged American troops, navigating through Japanese-controlled airspace with nothing but skill and audacity. Courage wears many faces. Sometimes it shows up in a man who will not abandon those in need. But he could not reach his family. On Christmas Eve, 1941, Gunn received orders to evacuate key personnel to Australia. Orders have an economy of their own. They ask you to choose between duty and heart. He drew all his military pay, borrowed as much money as he could from fellow officers, and prepared to take his family to safety. Men cobble plans from paper and promise, hoping the world will not conspire against them. But the Japanese advance was too swift. His family could not make it to the airfield in time. Gunn had to choose between abandoning them or disobeying orders. The cruel calculus of war. One choice saves the many, another comforts the few. He flew to Australia because orders were orders, because the war was bigger than one family, because staying meant death or capture. He climbed into the plane with the weight of his children on his tongue. Within weeks, on January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were rounded up by Japanese forces and taken to the University of Santo Tomas, converted into an internment camp for enemy civilians. The words land like lead. The university's lecture halls turned to cages. Names that once belonged to laughter were now lists in a ledger. Something broke inside Gunn when he learned this news. Not breaking all at once, a slow fracture that would shape everything he became. The man who continued fighting was not the same person who had left Manila. He had left behind his wife and 4 children in the hands of an enemy known for brutality. The war had found a private seam and tugged until a new persona emerged, not merely a soldier, but a man with a hunger sharpened by loss. Every day they remained in that camp was a day Gunn could not protect them. Protection became an obsession, turned to method. The only thing he could do was end the war faster. If he could not save his family directly, he could destroy every ship, every aircraft, every supply line that kept Japanese forces in the Philippines. Grim determination, revenge, and strategy braided together. Desperation becomes innovation when there is nothing left to lose. This was not official policy. This was vengeance disguised as innovation. Men who lose everything sometimes invent whole campaigns in their grief. When Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane in late July 1942 to take command of the Allied Air Force's Southwest Pacific area, he found a disaster. Imagine arriving on a shore to find the lifeboats few and morale thinner than the sails. His predecessor had been relieved. Morale was terrible. Equipment was inadequate. The Japanese controlled the air over New Guinea and were threatening Australia itself. The stakes were not maps on a wall. They were beaches, farms, and futures. General Douglas MacArthur, theater commander, had no confidence in his air forces and made that opinion very clear. Direct words from higher command can feel like salt on a wound. Yes, the wounds are visible now. Kenney was 53 years old, a World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star. The old wars echo into the new ones. Experience carries weight and stubbornness. He had taught at the Aeror Tactical School and was known for unconventional thinking. When MacArthur subjected him to an hour-long lecture about the shortcomings of Allied air power, Kenney listened politely and then asked for one thing: authority to send home anyone he considered deadwood. Leadership, when desperate, removes the polite furniture and asks blunt questions.
MacArthur, surprised by the request, agreed. Within weeks, Kenney had reshuffled his command structure, bringing in aggressive younger officers and creating a forward headquarters in New Guinea. Change moved fast when the alternative was collapse. To speed decision-making, he appointed Brigadier General Enos Whitehead as his forward commander, giving him authority to change aircraft assignments based on weather and tactical conditions, rather than waiting for orders from Brisbane. In war, time is a commodity you trade for survival. Faster decisions can mean the difference between retreat and foothold. But personnel changes meant nothing without effective weapons. Allied bombing from medium and high altitude was proving catastrophically ineffective against Japanese ships. High-altitude bombing gave ships time to maneuver. The B-17 flying fortresses were hitting less than 1% of their targets. Japanese convoys were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with impunity. Allied ground forces were dying in the jungle, while fresh Japanese troops poured ashore from ships that bombers could not sink. Here is the arithmetic of catastrophe: planes without teeth, ships dancing out of reach, soldiers counting on supply lines that never arrive. Kenney had been thinking about this problem since 1928, when he was an instructor at the tactical school. He had theorized about skip bombing, releasing bombs at very low altitude so they would skip across the water like stones on a pond, slamming into the sides of ships below the waterline where armor was weakest. The concept was sound. The execution was proving difficult. B-17s lacked forward-firing armament. Reflective. Ideas age slowly in committees. Sometimes they need a madman to make them sing. Coming in at mast height meant flying through with withering anti-aircraft fire, with nothing to suppress the gunners. Grim whisper. To fly that low was to invite hell. Then Kenney discovered Paul Gunn, and everything changed. In August 1942, Kenney learned that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was modifying A-20 Havoc light bombers without authorization. The modifications were crude but effective. Someone had removed the bombardier from the transparent nose and installed 4 50-caliber machine guns in his place, all firing forward. The idea was to strafe Japanese positions at extremely low altitude, suppressing ground fire before dropping bombs. Slowly, excited, the tinkerer in the hangar had become the missing variable in a failing equation. Kenney investigated and found Paul Gunn working essentially alone, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters and mounting them in attack aircraft. Gunn had taught himself aircraft modification through trial and error. He had no formal engineering degree, but he understood aircraft structures, weight distribution, and weapon systems from 2 decades of hands-on experience. Proudly, expertise isn't only diplomas. It is calloused hands, bad nights, and a refusal to believe a plane cannot be better. Most officers would have court-martialed Gunn for modifying military aircraft without authorization. Kenney immediately assigned him to his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and gave him an impossible mission: modify every A-20 in the theater for low-altitude attack and do it immediately. Gentle laugh, then sharp. The same act that looks like mutiny to some looks like salvation to others. Gunn worked 18-hour days.
He scoured aircraft from wrecked fighters, fabricated mounting brackets in makeshift workshops, and personally test-flew each modification. He added 4 50-caliber machine guns to the nose of each A-20, mounted additional guns along the fuselage, and installed bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs. Breathless admiration. Sweat, noise, and repetition, the alchemy of the workshop. The modified A-20s went into combat in September 1942, striking a Japanese airfield at Buna. The results exceeded all expectations. The strafer A-20s came in at treetop level, guns blazing, suppressing anti-aircraft positions before releasing their bombs. Japanese defenders, accustomed to high-altitude bombers they could see coming for minutes, had no time to react. The attack destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground and demonstrated that low-level strafing could revolutionize air warfare. Vivid. Imagine the sky turned into a blade, cutting aircraft on the ground before the defenders can find their bearings. Kenney had been thinking about this problem since 1928, when he was an instructor at the tactical school. He had theorized about skip bombing, releasing bombs at very low altitude so they would skip across the water like stones on a pond, slamming into the sides of ships below the waterline where armor was weakest. The concept was sound. The execution was proving difficult. B-17s lacked forward-firing armament. Tense. Bigger plane, bigger gamble. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. It was a twin-engined aircraft with a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches, powered by 2 Wright R260 radial engines producing 1,700 horsepower each. Normal armament consisted of 6 50-caliber machine guns for defense and 3,000 pounds of bombs. It carried a crew of 5: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner. Instructive, slightly reverent. The Mitchell's bones were engineered for another calling, but bones can be reworked.
The aircraft was named after General Billy Mitchell, the controversial advocate of air power, who had been court-martialed in 1925 for his outspoken views. Approximately 9,890 B-25s would eventually be built at 2 North American aviation plants, one in Inglewood, California, and another in Kansas City, Kansas. The B-25 had gained fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25Bs on a daring raid against Tokyo, launching from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The raid did minimal physical damage, but provided an enormous morale boost to Americans still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Most importantly, it forced Japan to keep fighter aircraft home to defend the mainland, rather than sending them to the front lines. But the B-25's primary role remained medium-altitude bombing, a mission at which it was proving ineffective against ships. Gunn looked at the B-25 and saw potential no one else recognized. The aircraft's nose section was large enough to mount multiple heavy machine guns. The twin-engine design provided redundancy. Losing one engine would not doom the aircraft. The sturdy construction could absorb punishment. Most importantly, the Mitchell had enough range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that the shorter-range A-20 could not.
A plane built for dignity, turned into an instrument of raw necessity by the hands of men who would not accept defeat. In late 1942, Gunn began modifying B-25s in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia. He was working with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative in theater. Fox was supposed to ensure that aircraft modifications followed factory specifications. Instead, he became Gunn's co-conspirator in what would become the most successful unauthorized aircraft modification program of the war. Two men bending rules in physics to meet a need that bureaucracies would not. The first challenge was removing the bombardier and his glass nose section. This saved weight and eliminated a vulnerable position that was useless for low-altitude attack. Gunn replaced the transparent nose with a solid metal housing, 4 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all firing forward and operated by the pilot. Each gun had 500 rounds of ammunition. The rate of fire was approximately 850 rounds per minute per gun, meaning the pilot could unleash a storm of lead that would shred any target in seconds. But 4 guns were not enough for Gunn. He added 2 more 50-caliber guns in cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, just below and behind the cockpit. These package guns extended slightly beyond the propeller arc, allowing them to fire without the bullets passing through the propeller disc. They were fixed, firing forward, adding to the pilot's firepower. Then Gunn made a radical decision. The B-25 had a dorsal turret with twin 50-caliber guns mounted behind the cockpit. This turret could rotate to defend against attacks from above and behind. Gunn locked the turret in the forward-firing position, adding 2 more guns to the pilot's control. The co-pilot could now operate these guns using a sight in the cockpit, or the pilot could fire all weapons simultaneously using a master trigger. Now the modified B-25 had 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, delivering approximately 180 pounds of projectiles per second. For comparison, a single P-51 Mustang fighter carried 6 50-caliber guns. The modified B-25 had the forward firepower of more than 1 fighter aircraft, concentrated in a platform that also carried 2,000 pounds of ordnance. 8 guns, 2,000 pounds of ordnance, a flying battering ram with the soul of a fighter. The modifications created significant engineering challenges. Adding weight to the nose shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward, making it nose-heavy and difficult to control. Gunn compensated by repositioning equipment aft and ballasting the tail section. The enormous recoil from 8 guns firing simultaneously created structural stress. Gunn reinforced the nose section with additional bracing. The guns generated tremendous heat and smoke. Gunn added ventilation systems and moved ammunition storage to reduce fire risk. Most critically, Gunn had to solve the problem of gun harmonization. The 8 guns needed to converge their fire at a specific point in front of the aircraft, typically between 200 and 400 yards. If the guns were not properly aligned, bullets would spray everywhere except the target.
Gunn developed a ground testing procedure, using targets placed at measured distances, adjusting each gun mount until all 8 weapons converged precisely. He test-fired the guns personally, making minute adjustments, refusing to sign off on any aircraft until it met his standards. The entire modification process took approximately 2 weeks per aircraft when working around the clock. Gunn trained maintenance crews to perform the work, establishing production line techniques. By December 1942, he had modified enough B-25s to equip the 91st Bombardment Squadron. The squadron needed a commander who understood low-altitude attack and was not afraid to violate conventional bombing doctrine. Kenney selected Major Ed LaMahena, a pilot who had risen from first lieutenant to major in just a few weeks due to his aggressive leadership in combat. LaMahena had demonstrated exceptional skill in low-level missions and had earned Kenney's trust. LaMahena and Gunn developed the tactics that would transform naval warfare. The modified B-25s would approach Japanese ships at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water, flying at maximum speed, approximately 300 miles per hour. At this altitude and speed, they were nearly impossible for ship gunners to track. The closing speed was too fast for manual aim, and the aircraft were already gone before gunners could adjust. As the B-25s approached, pilots would open fire with all 8 forward guns at a range of approximately 1,000 yards, walking the fire into the target ship. The stream of 50-caliber bullets would sweep the decks, killing or suppressing anti-aircraft gunners, destroying gun positions, shredding superstructures, and creating chaos. The purpose was not to sink the ship with gunfire, although the damage could be substantial. The purpose was to silence the ship's defenses and create terror among the crew. Then came the bombs. At a range of approximately 200 to 400 yards, flying at minimum safe altitude, the pilot would release a bomb with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb would leave the aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour, strike the water, and skip across the surface. The bomb would bounce once, perhaps twice, then slam into the side of the ship at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse ensured the bomb did not explode on impact. Instead, it would penetrate the hull, sink slightly beneath the surface, and then detonate. The explosion occurred in the most vulnerable part of the ship, below the armor belt, where hulls were thinnest. The blast was enhanced by the incompressibility of water, which transmitted shock waves with devastating efficiency. A single bomb exploding below the waterline could break a ship's keel, rupture fuel tanks, flood engine rooms, and cause catastrophic structural failure. By the time the bomb detonated, the B-25 was already past the target, climbing rapidly to avoid the blast and secondary explosions. The entire attack, from first gunshots to bomb release, took approximately 10 seconds. Skip bombing was not entirely new. The British had experimented with the technique. Some American pilots had tried it independently. But combining skip bombing with overwhelming forward firepower was Gunn's innovation. The strafer nose turned the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defenses before dropping bombs. This combination would prove devastating.
10 seconds. A lifetime in combat. The sea takes a sound and gives back a ruin. While Gunn was modifying aircraft, intelligence was monitoring Japanese naval movements. Ultra Intercepts, the coding operation that had cracked Japanese naval codes, provided detailed information about enemy plans. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known as FREL, was reading Japanese messages almost in real time. In late February 1943, FUMEL intercepted messages indicating a major Japanese convoy was being assembled at Rabaul on the island of New Britain. The convoy's destination was Lae on the northern coast of New Guinea. The cargo was troops and supplies for Japanese forces fighting Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was specific. 8 transport ships would carry approximately 6,900 troops of the 51st Division. 8 destroyers would provide escort. The convoy would depart Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943, and arrive at Lae approximately 3 days later. This was Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. If the convoy succeeded, Japanese forces would be strengthened significantly, potentially stopping Allied advances. If the convoy failed, Japan would lose thousands of experienced troops and likely never attempt another major reinforcement by sea. General Kenney saw an opportunity to test his modified aircraft and new tactics against the most important target since Pearl Harbor. He assembled every available aircraft in theater for a coordinated attack. The strike force would include B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters strafing at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing air cover, and modified B-25 strafers executing skip-bombing attacks. It would be the largest coordinated air operation in the Southwest Pacific to date. Kenney personally briefed squadron commanders on February 28th. The orders were explicit: find the convoy, attack without mercy, give no quarter, sink every ship. This was not a raid. This was annihilation. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded from the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy consisted of 8 cargo transports: Kyoko Maru, Kimbaru, Teom Maru, Noshima, Aitoyam Maru, Tomaru, Shinimaru, and Owawa Maru. 8 destroyers provided escort: Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters would fly air cover during the voyage. The convoy was the strongest force Japan had assembled for a resupply mission. Kimura expected to lose ships. Every previous convoy to New Guinea had suffered losses, but Japanese commanders believed enough ships would survive to deliver the troops. They were wrong. The convoy was spotted that afternoon by a B-24 Liberator on patrol. The crew radioed the position, course, and composition. Kenney's command immediately launched reconnaissance aircraft to track the convoy. Weather favored the Japanese initially.
2 tropical storms moved through the area, providing cloud cover and reducing visibility. Allied aircraft maintained contact, but could not attack effectively through the storms. The convoy made good progress, moving at 7 knots, approximately 8 miles per hour. The slow speed was dictated by the heavily loaded transports. The destroyers could have made 20 knots or more, but they had to match the convoy's pace. By nightfall on March 1st, the Japanese had covered approximately 90 miles. They were roughly halfway to Leh. The weather was deteriorating, which Kimura welcomed. Poor weather meant fewer Allied aircraft, but the storms also meant rough seas that pounded the transports. Troops below decks suffered terribly from seasickness in the crowded holds. On the morning of March 2, 1943, the weather improved slightly. Allied reconnaissance aircraft regained visual contact. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, 29 B-7 flying fortresses attacked from 5,000 feet. The high-altitude bombing was predictably ineffective. The B-7s claimed hits, but Japanese records indicate minimal damage. One transport may have been damaged slightly. The attack served one purpose. It forced the convoy to alter course repeatedly, slowing progress toward Leh. Throughout March 2nd, additional B-17 strikes continued. The flying fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from various altitudes. Ships maneuvered frantically, and Japanese fighters engaged the bombers. Several B-7s were damaged. 3 Japanese fighters were shot down, but no ships sank. The high-altitude attacks were harassing the convoy, not stopping it. As night fell on March 2, 1943, Kenney knew the critical attack would come the next morning. The modified B-25s were ready. Major Lana had briefed his pilots repeatedly. They had rehearsed the attack profile on a wrecked ship on February 28th, using combined formations of B-7, B-25, P-38, and bow fighters. The stage was set. Men had welded iron, rehearsed maneuvers, and listened to weather radios with a kind of prayerful attention. Dawn would decide whether a convoy moved supplies or moved into history.
The years dragged on. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. In the bamboo-thick jungles, the crickets still sang their nightly chorus, the rain still fell in heavy curtains, and the wind still bent the tall grass in waves. But for Hiro Onoda, time had stopped. 1945 never ended for him. He was still a soldier of the Emperor, still bound to the oath of obedience, still fighting a war the rest of the world had already buried beneath rubble and memory. Imagine that. The world celebrating peace, but one man clutching his rifle under the shadows, convinced the enemy lurked just beyond the trees. Reports of Japan's surrender trickled into the Philippines. Leaflets fluttered down from planes. Radios blared voices declaring the end of the war. Civilians whispered the words, "The war is over." But to Onoda, these were tricks, psychological warfare. He had been trained to distrust enemy propaganda. The leaflets, lies. The broadcasts, deceptions. The civilians, pawns of the Americans. He held fast to his orders. Never surrender. Never take your own life. Fight until your superior officer commands you otherwise. And so he did. The jungles became his battlefield. Every rustle of branches, every shadow between the banana trees, every flicker of movement in the night he treated as the enemy. Farmers who ventured too close to his hideouts found their huts burned. Patrols searching the hills sometimes exchanged fire with him. Villagers whispered of the phantom soldier who prowled the mountains. Year after year, decade after decade, he persisted. His uniform grew ragged, patched with whatever cloth he could scavenge. His boots split, soles worn thin. His rifle, carefully oiled and guarded, still gleamed like the day it left the factory. For Onoda, war was no longer strategy or duty. And yet, he was not alone. In those first years after 1945, he had companions, fellow holdouts who refused to believe the war was truly over. Together they hunted, raided, and whispered in the dark about the glorious day when the Imperial Army would return. But one by one his comrades fell. Some surrendered, broken by hunger. Others were killed in skirmishes with Philippine police. By the early 1950s, only Onoda remained.
Alone. The jungle became his only ally. The birds his only company. The rustling of leaves, his only conversation. For him, the emperor still lived, still reigned, still expected his obedience. And Hiro Onoda would not betray him. Then came the 1960s, a world transformed. Men were flying into space, nations divided by Cold War. Television filled living rooms across America. But in the Philippine mountains, Onoda still crouched in muddy foxholes, clutching a rifle built for a war 20 years gone. Imagine a man frozen in time while the entire world moved on without him. 2 decades in the jungle, and still he believed. But fate was not done with him. In 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki ventured into the Philippines. He had heard the rumors of a soldier still hiding, still fighting, nearly 30 years after the war. Against all odds, Suzuki found him. He called out into the thick undergrowth, announcing who he was. And slowly from the shadows of the forest, Hiro Onoda stepped forward. His uniform faded, his body lean with hunger, but his eyes still sharp, still disciplined, still ready for battle. Suzuki told him, "The war is over.
Japan has surrendered. Please come home." Onoda shook his head. No, he could not surrender without orders from his superior. Until then, his duty was not finished. That was the measure of his resolve. Nearly 30 years had passed, but the orders burned in him like fire. Hold out, resist, never surrender. And so Suzuki returned to Japan and found Onoda's old commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. And together they journeyed back into the jungles of Lubang. And there, in 1974, Onoda finally heard the words he had waited for. "Lieutenant Onoda, you are relieved of duty. The war is over." Only then did he lower his rifle.
March 1974. Manila. The world watched in disbelief. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously, and crowds pressed in for a glimpse. And there, at the center of it all, hero Onoda stepped forward. Dressed in his tattered uniform, his rifle gleaming from decades of care, his officer's sword still at his side, he bowed and presented himself to President Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines. The jungle ghost, the forgotten soldier, the man who had refused to believe the war was over. And then, before the cameras, before the world, he did what he had sworn he would never do without orders. He surrendered. He placed his sword into Marcos's hands, a gesture both ancient and solemn. After 29 years in hiding, after nearly 30 decades of battles fought in his mind, Onoda was finally free. But freedom came at a price. When he returned to Japan, he found a homeland unrecognizable. Neon lights now glowed over crowded streets. Radios had become televisions. Old wooden houses had been replaced with glass towers. The youth no longer bowed to tradition, but embraced the wild rhythms of modern life. For Onoda, it was as though he had stepped out of one century and into another. He had gone to war for an empire and returned to a nation he could barely understand. He struggled with the silence of peace. For nearly 30 years, his heartbeat had matched the rhythm of danger. Every sound in the jungle had meant life or death. But now, in the hum of Tokyo's trains, in the chatter of businessmen, in the neon glow of Shibuya, he felt like a stranger in his own country. He would later admit that in some ways, the jungle had been easier. Yet Hiro Onoda did not crumble. He wrote his memoirs, told his story, and traveled the world as a reminder of what loyalty and obsession could demand of a man. His tale became both legend and warning, a story of unyielding devotion and the terrible cost of refusing to let go.
Hiro Onoda lived until 2014. At the age of 91, the last samurai of World War II closed his eyes for the final time. He had lived long enough to see both the darkness of war and the relentless march of peace. His life a reminder that sometimes battles are not fought with bullets and swords, but with belief, memory, and time itself. And so, dear listener, we leave the jungle behind. We leave Hiro Onoda with his ghosts, his honor, and his story. But his footsteps still echo, his choices still whisper, his legend still lingers. Because some wars never truly end.
If you've made it this far into the story, thank you, truly. These tales of history are more than just battles and dates. They're about people, about sacrifice, courage, mistakes, and the strange, beautiful fragility of being human. If you enjoyed this storytelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Give this video a like and share it with someone who also loves history. Every click, every comment, every share helps keep these stories alive for the next generation. Until next time, keep remembering the past, keep honoring the stories, and never forget the lessons history leaves behind. This is your storyteller, signing off.